Hello and good morning, everyone, on this third day of Illusion HorrorCon 2025, where I'm sitting together with fantastic panelists who are talking a bit about Ludo narrative dissonance, or maybe something else. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us on the third day, and I'm very excited. Well, let's start. Who are you? Let's start with Fern on my top left here.
Always me first, I swear. Hi, I'm Fern Milton. I'm one half of Cobblepath Games. We've made a few things. The other half is Steph, who's also here in IE direction. I don't know where. Um, our flagship title is Locus, which is a horror title. Um, a horror game about guilt and regret, with custom monsters for each character, things like that. Um, I am the lead designer of Cobblepath, and I do this full time at the moment. So yeah, that's me. Hi.
Thank you. Let's go to Paweł.
Hi everyone, my name is Paweł Kicman. I'm a tabletop RPG designer from Poland. I'm known for titles like award-nominated Korborg, which is corporate horror, some other games like Whispers of the Woods, which is folk horror, and Odyssey of the Giant, which is not a horror, and a bunch of different supplements for Morgborg, Cyborg, and other smaller stuff. I also teach game critique, and funnily enough, my next lesson next Wednesday, I'll be doing a class on ludonarrative dissonance, believe it or not. So, and yep, that's me. So, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, then you should have done the moderation, I suppose, as a preparation. But thank you for being here. Steph, what about you?
Yep. So I'm the other half of Cobblepath Games alongside Fern. Um, I'm the lead writer working on Locus, which is, as Fern said, our main kind of title. Um, we've also done some comedy games as well, like Stacks of Goblins and Coffee and Chaos, both of which have won awards. But Locus is the one I guess we're more known for in this space, which is yeah,
Okay,
what that is.
thank you. And last but not least, Paul.
And this is where putting it on mute was a mistake. So, Baldowski, I am basically I have a dual life. I by day I am unfortunately a business analyst. By night, I write both independently and freelance. Independently, I am known for Cthulhu Hack, the Desanction, which is an Elizabethan supernatural game, Sanction, which is a general version of that game, which has various horror-related genre supplements. I am currently working on Kirk Bird, which is a Nordic noir investigation game, which will certainly have horrible elements to it. And I also freelance, so I have worked on the likes of Free League's Symbaroum, Chaosium's Rivers of London, Mongoose's Paranoia, Trophy, and Pelgrane Press's Night's Black Agents.
Fantastic. Uh, so I think we have a wide diversity of panelists here, which is fantastic. And I want to kick this off basically with a simple question. If you can define in your words what you understand under ludonarrative dissonance, and maybe if you have an example for it.
I'm happy to kick off with
Please.
my understanding of it. So, ludonarrative dissonance originally kind of came over from the video game space as when the gameplay or the actions the character takes as the player don't grok with the narrative and the theme of the game. So it's that kind of, well, hang on, if the story is telling me that I'm broke, why do I have like all of the money in the world from all these bandits I've just slain? That kind of, it doesn't quite fit, or it doesn't help tell the story in a meaningful way.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything to add? Or an example?
I mean, a prime example. I'll go in there first because then no one else can grab it. Would be a prime example of Ludonarrative dissonance in tabletop would be, broadly speaking, that Dungeons and Dragons, the age-old example of role-playing game, in and of itself has always been designed around the notion of heroics. It has. You just have to look at Appendix N in the original Dungeon Master's Guide to see that it is filled with very much the heroic side of fantasy, where you have highly capable individuals who make their name through the powers of swords and sorcery. If you look at Elric or Conan or something like that, these are the heroes we're talking about. And yet you then have a situation where, as a game, that people have looked to make it work with other genres, which, for example, in the case of horror, you rarely find yourself in a situation where heroics are going to get you anywhere but killed. And yet the average D&D character is not going to be, it's probably going to, I don't know why Final Destination type deaths are coming into mind, but most of them would probably survive a Final Destination type death, because of their hit points. You'd be sat there for half an hour waiting for the garage door to cut them in half, or the lawnmower to do its work. Sorry, at this time in the morning, but fundamentally, the way characters exist and are buffed for heroics make it very difficult without some serious work under the bonnet to make it functionally viable, to make it horrific.
So would you say that very much lends itself to the kind of long held kind of acceptance that for a horror game to really feel tense and horror, you kind of need to be a bit powerless in what you can do, and that's the aspect that it goes against?
I mean, in that instance, it feels like certain genres of horror would be difficult. The final, the final destination, final person type horror. You might get the notion that in like Halloween or Scream, to go in the movie side of things, you've got a viable way to have those characters who seem to persist. But I think, for example, D&D would be best suited, therefore, for horror that leans into maybe the psychological side of things. But it doesn't have the mechanics for it. but you might be able to generate horror that way, rather than the horrific of people having beings cut down in swathes, because the players are intentionally not meant to be cut down in the same way. You might be able to therefore manage like a zombie horror, where you have hordes of zombies who are going to be cut down in swathes, but then you would have to have some kind of, mechanically there is no way that necessarily people are going to die, so you may be able to like a Walking Dead style approach.
I think my sort of general sort of take on it is, fundamentally, D&D is a game about overcoming obstacles. The whole setup of the game is you have a DM, they put obstacles in front of the players and the players overcome them. This is fine. This is a fine way to structure a game, but it isn't a good setup for horror, because overcoming obstacles feels great and feels like progress. And those things are not the primary things you want people getting out of a horror game. Generally speaking, I mean, everything we're talking about is going to be general here, because like you can talk about specific stuff, but horror is a very wide genre. And there's also the factor that for some very interesting but quite complex reasons, it is actually very easy to, well, not very easy, but it's arguably easier to make a sort of single session, single episode, single kind of moment piece of horror out of something that's not designed for horror because of the kind of juxtaposition with the other things than it is to make something that is consistently horror. And it's also a very different process. So I think, just to preface everything, we're probably all going to be talking mostly, I would guess, about building actual like full horror games where the whole experience is built around horror rather than creating moments of horror in otherwise non-horror games, which is a very different beast. But yeah, to return to, sorry, that was a tangent. I do that. I think that fundamentally there's a lot of specific things you can call on in D&D's design and a lot of non-horror game designs of how it's not going to be a great mechanical framework for horror. But I think that fundamentally the biggest thing for me, at least, is that it is about overcoming obstacles. It's about getting stronger. It's about achieving things. It's about triumphing. And the moments where you don't do that are the exceptions to the rule in D&D, rather than the kind of like a standard part of the tapestry. They are kind of aberrations in the thing, and they can be interesting aberrations, and they're designed to be there, but they are designed generally to be aberrations, to be key moments, because you don't expect to lose a fight to the random goblins you're fighting, and you expect to generally get stronger every session, and such like that. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's the reward mechanic in sense of like slaying multiple goblins or whatever that kind of incentivizes you to kind of continue that same trade, although you're heroic agents in a sense that are meant to be like, oh yeah, we are, the saviors and we're heroic and we are nice, but then at the same time you slay bandits left and right in order to get their money and loot and so forth. But good morning, audience, and thank you, Tom, for also chiming in. Who brought up a good point about that Ravenloft, actually, when we consider D&D, kind of changed a bit the aspect of opening that world for horror settings, which, at least in that point kind of shifted a bit maybe towards an idea of how this adaptation could work. But yeah, Paweł, is there anything from your side still that you want to add maybe before we...
Well, yeah, I just would like to take a step back because
please.
what Steph mentioned about like the basically the term coming from video games, and kind of there is an issue here because in video games you have, it's all about this disconnect between the narrative and the gameplay, and you have the narrative set, like it's written, it's in there, and you have gameplay mechanics that basically limits what you can do within the game. In tabletop RPGs, it's a bit different because you have some kind of narrative, but you build that narrative as you go, and you can basically, you don't have any limits. You have a GM who can be that limit, but other than that, it's, it's a kind of a sandbox, right? And on the other hand, you are not limited by mechanics the same way you're limited by them in a video game, because you can actually, on top of the mechanics, you have actions that you can take within the fiction that are, again, kind of limitless. Obviously you cannot do certain things that wouldn't be possible within that context, but then again, you're not limited to a degree as you are, in a first-person shooter or survival horror, etc. Right? Like you have certain things that you can do, things you cannot do, and that kind of on itself creates that dissonance in tabletop RPGs, which is very difficult to overcome. So I think by default, every tabletop RPG is kind of built towards that disconnect, and it's actually something that, from the design perspective, it's very difficult to kind of overcome. There are things we'll probably say a bit more in a minute about it, like we can actually enhance and kind of build a harmonious relation between the gameplay and the narrative, but it is difficult because, as I mentioned, but by default there is this kind of field for the players to break that, like to kind of to bring that disconnect, and it's and I don't think, because I guess when many people say, oh, it's a dissonance, so it has to be something bad. Not necessarily, right? Like it's something that just is. It's not good or bad. It's just, it's maybe up to us how we interpret it. But at the end of the day, I guess it's all about kind of finding what works for us within that disconnect that will push the game to, for example, if we play a certain genre uh, for the genre to kind of have the elements that we want to want to see and build towards. But again, it's up for the players and the GM to actually do that. So from that perspective, from the narrative perspective, it's very difficult to build a game that would completely stop the dissonance from happening.
It's a good point. And I think I also would say, like, as you mentioned, it strongly depends on the GM and the players, because, like, sometimes I would say I bend the rules as well if something doesn't seem right to me, and so, like, I just overcome the dissonance by just ignoring how the system is meant to be handled, because I'm just saying, like, narrative goes first. So, like, in this instance, I want to focus on the narrative. But yeah, that's a good point, that in the design aspect of it, it might be a bit difficult. I guess, in since we have here pretty much all game designers on the table. Did you, in your products or in your designs, encounter this kind of thought process, and maybe more so, how did you kind of overcome it in order to create the harmony, so that it actually works out?
Yes, is the simple
Yes,
answer.
great.
So, as Pavel said, there is like, as a game designer in tabletop RPGs, you always have to be aware of the fact that there is going to be this layer of interaction with your product, your piece of art, that you have no control over in a way that other mediums have control. A film can control the kind of the atmosphere of the moment in a way that TTRPGs, as designers, we can't. We can suggest how that can go, but we can't actually. We have to cede control over that, and I think you have to make peace with that, especially in a genre like horror, where it's so subjective and it's so emotive. But there are absolutely things you can do. You just have to be aware that there are going to be limits. So with Locus, we very much designed it with the intent of, we wanted something that would scare me and Steph. So there's a bunch of stuff in there that's kind of built around the things that scare us. But the core kind of, one of the things that we did with the system was we kind of pinned down the core kind of narrative conceits and essentially kind of codified them into the game, which I think a lot of smaller games do de facto because they're built for much smaller, kind of more pointed experiences. But Locus is very much, it's about guilt, it's about regret, it's about past transgressions coming back to haunt you, and about how characters deal with that. And it having that central through line allowed us to kind of build a rule system that supports that. And also, and I think this is the really important bit, it allowed us to flag to the people reading the book and to the people who want to play it what the game is about in a really meaningful and substantive way. We aren't, Locus is not a game that sells itself as being the general horror game for every horror that you're ever going to want to play. It is a very specific kind of, it has a theme. It isn't an existential horror game. It's not a cosmic horror game. It's a personal horror game about your characters, and in particular with a focus on guilt and regret. That kind of being able to say to the people reading the book, this is what this game is about, this is what it's built to do, goes a really long way, I think, in combating the potential dissonance that might come from a group kind of creating their own story in something that doesn't quite gel with the game, in about as much as you can do as a designer.
Yeah, I think just to support that, an example of one of the areas where we've done that is the way we've done the stats for the characters. Characters in Locus get negatively statted, so you have to put effort into making your character, and like when you build them, you focus on the negative aspects of them. Are they frail? Are they clumsy? Are they really bad at first impressions? Like what building up the things that in play you might then yourself have elements of regret about, but dealing with that is, I think, a more harmonious way of sort of focusing the design of the game with how it's written, as Ferne said.
Yeah, and just to kind of go off of that, I think what Fern and Steph said, that it's not only about them thinking about, oh, how to avoid the dissonance, it's more about like how to actually make that harmony, like how to bring those elements mechanically that would support that narrative. And I think kind of that's the key. Not only about thinking, oh, I shouldn't do that. It's more I should do this and that, right? And I think the wonderful, like my ideal example is Dread. And basically, just pulling the Jenga blocks from the Jenga tower as a kind of main resolution mechanic is just so brilliant, and it works for the genre so well. And I know I will never design a game that will be so elegant in that kind of in that regard. But what I've done for Whispers of the Woods is one of the first things that I actually came up when designing this game years ago. It was only a kind of a small prototype back then, was a blind roll. So basically, it's a game about going into the woods, and the woods are shifting, ever changing, and kind of very mysterious. There are supernatural elements to encounter, and the blind rolls are a mechanic that's introduced when you actually face something that is difficult to comprehend. And so you basically close your eye, roll the die, and you guess the result. The closer your guess, the better the outcome. And obviously, you can min-max this. You can always say 3 or 4 and kind of be closer to the success. But the way it's done, it's you want to have the best possible result, because the consequences are like consequences of the perfect result are great. Like you can get some super fun boons. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to actually bring over that kind of element from the game narrative into the meta play. So it's not only about the mechanics and the narrative, but also about how we interact with the game physically, right? So like exactly with the Jenga. So, you encounter something you don't understand. So it's like going blind into a situation. So that's why you roll blindly and you guess, because you cannot be sure about what you're seeing within the game. So that's kind of what I wanted to do, and it's super fun. And obviously it's pretty limited, and as I mentioned, mechanically it can be kind of you can cheat a little bit. But then again, it's just something I wanted to try, and I always liked games that tries to kind of put some like to blend the mechanics and the narrative to actually like for the players to actually interact with physically. So it could be other resolution systems like uh, I don't know, just using the items from real world. Like you look at your right, and this is an item you will use in the game, etc. So it's a lot of fun, and it does bring a little bit of a harmony, but not through the mechanics itself, but through kind of the interaction, kind of the meta play as well. So I find that pretty interesting, and it's not always working super well, but at least we are trying. So yeah, so Dread is perfect, but we can try.
I think you talked about kind of the meta aspects of it. I think one of the things that for me can make dissonance, not always, but there are certain games where there's quite a lot of heavy lifting done by the rule book. So you spend a lot of time not at the table, but with your like reading, trying to catch up on stuff. And that's not a bad thing. Some of these are quite like games where you expect to have it to be looking stuff up all the time. Dark Heresy is one. You have to do a lot of referencing on tables to see the outcomes of things. Mutants and Masterminds, you have to constantly, or I have to anyway, check the rules of how each power works, because they can get quite technically robust. And I find that having to come away from the story to double check or cross-reference stuff makes it more of an exercise of I can't think of the right way to phrase it, more of a technical exercise rather than a storytelling experience. So in that regard, something with simple rules, not necessarily rules light, but simple rules that don't require you to cross-reference those tables, can make some harmony in terms of my experience at a table telling a story. Now, that's very much your mileage may vary. That's not going to be a problem for everyone. And that's an example, I think, of the fact that this harmony and dissonance can be quite a personal thing with how you yourself will be engaging at the table. Obviously, as a DM, you might have a very different experience to that than the player. But that's I don't know if anyone else finds that or if it's just me.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, in terms, Dark Heresy, I was going to say Warhammer in general. Notionally, the grim darkness is prime ground for horror, but the rule books all tend to be an inch thick, have been since the 80s or when the original Warhammer role-playing game came out, and it means that the heavy lifting of horror has to fall to the GM to know when to step away from the rulebook, and that kind of at that point means that you're improvising, and it's such a rich world really for horror, but is its own worst enemy if you then feel, and this is me coming away from spending I think I ran a Warhammer campaign for 30-40 weeks, and then finally said, I can't do this anymore, because I feel that I have to look at the book, and the book is becoming my enemy. That to give you the game that you want to play Warhammer, which kind of means I should play into the book, but at the same time I feel that the book is becoming a barrier. So as a result, when I write games, the finest review I've read was somebody saying that my games are terse, i.e. thin. I just can't. I find it very difficult to write a lot if I've got the point across. The idea of coming up with a book that's even a centimeter thick feels like a challenge, unless I can make it like A5 or A6. As a result, it does feel like at heart, again, to refer to Warhammer, it's just a D100 mechanic. If everything just fell to a singular mechanic and you didn't feel compelled to look at a multitude of tables, then maybe you could use the mechanics to benefit you. So in Cthulhu Hack, I wanted to have the notion of competence that you could almost rely on. That as you go through the game, you're never going to struggle to find the clues and the information that will carry forward. The challenge for you as a player is wondering whether it's going to be, it's not the words that are coming to mind is worth it, but knowing that by pushing forward you are creating the challenge. It's almost, and I agree with Dread as a prime example of that, where you are building the tension outside of the notion of competence of the character. That tower, and the fact you are being required to push more and more bricks out of it, is building a tension which is separate from the actual competence of the character. I've used, for example, the Dread mechanic, and then, well, I've run it because Rebellion Games wrote it, and it's based on Dread, the Judge Dredd version of it, which is less horror, but there's definitely horror in that world as well, and the notion of very competent characters who nevertheless are faced by situations that generate tension. So with Cthulhu Hack, that was the notion. You could have people who could find the clues all the time, The challenge is, do you keep doing it? Because when you do it, you make the roll after you find the information out, because that roll is not determining whether you found the information. It's determining whether that information adds to the web of concern, worry, tension, stress, horror, that when you realize that what you've uncovered somehow connects into your past, something that's happened to you, makes a connection with you and adds to that web, that notion of cosmic horror, that you're either unexpectedly significant in that, you know, you are somehow connected with this horror that you've been investigating, or you are utterly insignificant, realizing that there is something about what you've discovered which pushes you closer and closer to your breaking point.
And that's interesting because now I kind of realized that maybe we're not talking about ludonarrative dissonance. We're talking about ludo role-playing dissonance, because maybe it's not about the disconnect between the narrative and the gameplay mechanics, but because we are talking about role-playing games, and I always like to envision this as a kind of a spectrum, and on the one end it's just role-playing, and on the other spectrum, and on the other end it's a game. So maybe the disconnect is somewhere here, right? Like it's not about the narrative, but about those role-playing mechanics, and like, so maybe not mechanics, but the role-playing itself and the mechanics. And then it's interesting, and from what all you've said about kind of your approach, because then it becomes more clear that you're thinking about those role-playing elements actually, and not just how the narrative will be built, but about the players and their actions, and how kind of to tie the mechanics to their experience, and then it makes a lot of sense, I guess.
Good. That's a good point. Um, that I have not even considered, but yeah, that's actually true. Anything to add on that grand summary here?
So the main reason that I'm not talking is because it was a very good point that
Yeah.
I didn't really feel the need to add anything to. But I will opine on it a little bit further, I guess. Which is, there is a very so ludonarrative dissonance as a term is a very awkward one for TTRPGs for a bunch of reasons. It is from a medium where the narrative, as was mentioned earlier, is a set thing that's pre-written, that's pre-done, and that the people who make the game did. One of the things about tabletop RPGs is, yes, there are pre-written stories and adventures for them, but if you are a game designer making a system, the main thing that you're making isn't a story. So, like, there's always going to be that kind of weird disconnect where the story that is played at the table, the narrative that people experience, isn't actually a thing you've created substantively. So is there ludonarrative dissonance? I kind of think yes, but also it's a bit of a different beast to the version that we often talk about in terms of video games, where the term originally came from. And you've also got the sort of this kind of layer of, also, the bigger the game is, the wider its scope generally becomes. So, like, if you're looking at, say, like Wretched and Alone, that game is about being a person in a spaceship where everything's going wrong and you've got a very slim chance of getting out. That game is designed very definitively for a specific story, and while that story is going to change every time people play it, the story is pretty set because it's a small zine game, because it's a solo game, it's designed to do that specific story. Compare that to something like Locus, that's kind of in the middle, I guess, which is, broadly speaking, you're always going to be people coming to a place that then traps them somehow, who are then dealing with the demons of their own past and their own mistakes. But what that can actually look like, and and how it manifests, and the people involved, and the mistakes in those pasts, and the challenges they overcome, can be wildly different. And then you take it further and go even further out, and you get to, like, World of Darkness, and you've got these very kind of wide, sprawling, open kind of systems where you can do a whole lot of different stuff with them. And at that point, you've pretty much relinquished any kind of grip on narrative that you've got. So can you even talk about ludonarrative dissonance with World of Darkness? Yes, but possibly not in the same way that you would with a video game, I think is my really non-committal answer to follow on from what was just said.
Yeah, I think there's really something to that, what Paweł said about it being almost a degree of Ludo roleplay dissonance, where, how much does the game get in the way of the game? It's interesting because one of the things we've been embarking on the last couple of years is running a LARP and like designing a LARP roleplay system. And it's super true that, nothing you write is going to survive contact with players. It just won't. So, is that always a bad thing in terms of the aim of what you're going for?
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe kind of to get a bit more specifics, because I think the point of Ludo roleplay dissonance is a good point. To ask maybe about when it comes to the actual table and you're running a game and you notice that something kind of starts to wear off the path that you've created. In a sense, there is dissonance being created in the game, and or the other players are noting that. Are there any ideas, recommendations from your perspective that you would say, like how to tackle this, especially since kind of we try to focus on a lot of advice for new GMs throughout this con?
Yeah, I think I can go first if that's all right. So one of my main pieces of advice is around pacing. We've actually dedicated a bit of the Locust Director's Guide to talking about pacing and like how it can help alleviate the need to laugh sometimes. Like when you can't hold tension forever. That you're going to find a breaking point, and a lot of the time that can lead into farce or comedy because you just need some relief. So the idea of pacing well as the GM is being able to pick up on those tells to say the tension's been going on a little bit. We need a small bit of reprieve so that we can enjoy that build again. And it's not about devolving into farce ever so often. It's about easing off the brakes a little bit, letting people come down and then building them back up, because it's that climb of the terror that's a really fun bit for people who enjoy it. So yeah, baking in those rest points can be really good in helping keep the overall arc on point and not falling into like losing the atmosphere completely and then having that dissonant. We can't really get back into character. We can't really, it's become funny and bizarre and less of that atmospheric storytelling you might be going for.
Okay. Paul is back. Oops.
Sorry, cat-based situation. Anyway, so I missed what was said, but what immediately occurred to me around the situation, and this is weirdly driven by I read too many Reddit posts, I think. Just talk to people. I mean, it's weird. People will come onto Reddit and say, how can I do this? Like there's a mechanical answer in a book. There's a combination both of the notion of the session zero. If this is more than one game, have that pre-session where you talk to people, what sort of game we're going to be playing. Because the other thing is, it's possible to maybe have a 5-minute zero rather than a session zero at the start of a con game or a one shot, where you just be open with people about the sort of game you want to run. Because I've had so many times I've heard people say they've signed up for a game and they have then experienced one of the worst sessions of their life because somebody came along and just ran completely at odds with everything that was going on. Every player in the session, there's a cat. Everything the player was doing, everything the event, the scenario wanted to do, everything the GM wanted to do, they just ran against it. I don't want to make all my examples about Lovecraftian horror, but I have written one, so I'll go with that. It's the notion of somebody who comes to the session having read some of the stories and is determined to say it's a me go or it's a deep one, not engaging with the horror, engaging with the mechanics, engaging with the bestiary. And it's kind of that kind of needs to be dealt with in a very human way. You can't. It's. I almost feel like the old school approach to it is to say, "Well, just kill them off." No, don't don't do that. You don't have to do that. Just take a. It's almost like, I tell you what, guys. Folks, we'll take a 5-minute break. I think we just need to have a discussion as a group. What's going on here? Because otherwise, it becomes. It's like you're trying to add mechanics to human existence, rather than just saying, look. And it's sometimes when I do a lot of convention run games, one shots, where you literally just sat down with people for 2-3 hours or something. You may never play a game with them again, but let's make this the best possible experience by treating each other as human beings and saying, just have a couple of minutes to say, look, this isn't going the way I'd hoped because. And don't maybe make it very personal. It doesn't have to be about that person. They will probably realize it's about them. But this is the sort of game that I want this to be. This is a horror. This is a cosmic horror. This is a body horror. This is whatever approach you want to be, and be quite honest about it. And mechanically, it means because as a game master or whatever storyteller, whatever your approach here you've sat down wanting to use X system to run Y adventure. You need the secret source of Z of actually having a group who understands those two things. And maybe that means that in that situation, you can run a Pathfinder horror game or whatever, because you've said in advance that's what we're looking to play, and it's not going to be. I'm going to kind of ease back the notion of heroics. We want this to be about horrifics. Okay, made a word. Sort of thing. But it's engaging. It's engaging with the table to engage with the game and the system in a way that fulfills, and it should be fun. It's horror, but horror should be fun, even when it grosses you out or leaves you walking away from the table feeling tense. But it's a fun tense. It's that stress of anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to agree wholeheartedly. I think, that initial communication, making sure you're in alignment with the other people at the table, with the story you all want to tell together, is so important.
Mm-hmm.
I think something that I imagine that everybody here and watching this has had an experience, especially with horror, where you've watched a horror movie or a horror show or played a horror game, and for whatever reason you weren't in the mood and it just wasn't scary, even though it might be something that you might typically be into. And I think it's worth noting that horror especially, but pretty much everything, needs to have a level of buy-in from the people who are engaging with it. They need to go in with a vaguely correct mindset to actually engage with it on its own terms. And it's kind of like doubly, triply, order of magnitude more true with TTRPGs, because a lot of the tricks that more visual audio mediums use to overcome that kind of hill, at least as designers, we don't have. We can't play music for your session because you're playing Locus. I mean, some TTRPGs do release soundtracks, but we can't make you play them. We can't affect what kind of day your players have had, or the GMs had. We can't affect the lighting at the table or any of that sort of stuff, which is how a lot of the best movies and the best games overcome people not really being keyed into it. So it's super important to have those conversations that were just being talked about and to like engage with the human element of this and sort of make and prime people for what they're going to be playing, essentially. Because yeah, it's that a lot of these tools just aren't there, and that buy-in's kind of essential for just enjoying media.
Something else I want to touch on. So I've not run at conventions. I've run plenty of games, but not in a convention setting. And I imagine that very much doubles down. Paul, feel free to correct me on not knowing what kind of day someone's had or even who that person really is. I imagine that, again, just kind of by an order of magnitude makes that so much more important again, because you don't get a lot of time, I assume, to get to know each other.
Yeah, and the factors in that situation are nothing in the environment is in your control. I mean, you can to some measure you can come check out the table, know where the seats are, get a view of what the noise level will be. I have heard people trying to play music in a convention environment. I have quickly asked somebody to get them to tone that down because bizarrely enough, if you're in a room with 6 other games going on, you don't want one of those games having a soundtrack, despite the fact that the GM has likely spent a lot of time preparing it. But mechanically, yeah, you are completely at odds with everything going on. And if you want to run a horror game, you definitely do need to sort of do a little preamble to discuss it. How are we going to do this? How are we going to engage with it? And I have certainly run successful horror games in an environment that the biggest environment I've done it in is with a hall with 15 other games going on. I have run a horror game more than once, and a horror game that's worked to the extent that in one example I think of, I felt so revulsed by what I was saying. I needed to X card my own game to step away. So it's possible to do it, but you definitely need buy-in. Yeah.
I think what I want to add on that is there's also a difference, obviously, in if you go to live conventions, so in person, compared to like something like we do an online convention, because here in our convention we kind of organize the game threads and everything kind of a week before, so like there should be enough time for players and GMs to interact, to kind of set the lines, to kind of communicate ahead of time, to clearly kind of have enough communication before the game. But yes, in a live setting, that can be something completely different, where you maybe just sign up the day off and you meet these people for the first time. You don't have really kind of an idea. Yeah, so good advice throughout the bench. There's a question from the audience. Or Paweł, do you have anything to add?
No, absolutely not. Just I could only reinforce what's been said. So
Okay. There is a questions from the audience about what are some ways that you find useful to utilize the mechanics to develop the characters, for example, in a one-shot or in a campaign setting that kind of, and I think builds up on the Ludo role-playing harmony in this case.
So the cop-out answer is it depends on the game and it depends on the mechanics you're dealing with. Like, it's very difficult to kind of make any sort of declarative statements about how you can use mechanics to influence your characters and buy in and things, when it really depends on the game and the mechanics, and what they're looking to do and what their point is. Yeah, that's my kind of cop-out answer. I'm really sorry.
So I think one of the elements is not to fight against the mechanics if it's shaping the character. I think is one direction I might go to try and answer that question. Is, if in Locus, when you fail a roll, you don't necessarily fail the task. It just means you'll have a bad consequence from it later on. And those are moments that can shape a character. Like, you struggled to do something, but you've done it and then later on it turns out that was a terrible idea because XYZ, now there's a monster in the closet. So you know, you can build character moments out of those mechanical outcomes. So it's just about leaning into it and being willing to work with it rather than go, well, no, that's not right. My character wouldn't have done that, or it shouldn't have gone like that. And that feeling of like, you know, it doesn't make sense if thinking of any other system, if you've got a strength-based skill and your character is failing mundane, can't kick a stone down a road tasks, you know, those kinds of things. Floundering a little bit if anyone wants to hop in. It's a difficult one to answer, for sure.
I was going to let Paweł pop in, so he's not last.
Cheers, Paul. So I think, as you know, as you mentioned, it really comes down to what game you're playing, and I feel sometimes it's just like not fighting against it. Like some games with investigation mechanics. I don't know, Trail of Cthulhu or whatever other game you have. It's always like this is such a huge disconnect, and always been and always will be when you have mechanics of you know investigating things, or you have like riddles, puzzles, stuff like that, and you know you have a player who's like, okay, I know the answer, but does my character knows the answer? And that's the whole other thing for another panel, I guess. But I guess it's about not fighting like against that, right? Like just having mechanics not to break the character, but also not to break the player. If they want to be like, okay, I want to kind of work around it and find the answer because I know it, me as a player, I kind of know what's up, right? But my character has, I don't know, 5 intelligence out of 20 and would probably wouldn't know, but I just want to kind of role play it somehow to kind of get there because I know it. So it's just not fighting against or through it and just letting that kind of narrative slip away or kind of even break that like to make that dissonance happen for the sake of role playing, I guess, or kind of for the sake of player maybe even more. So it's not always about the kind of development of the character itself, but also about having fun at the table, you know, ultimately, especially if it's a one shot. You know, if you're playing a long campaign, then okay, again, maybe there's more time and there's more kind of structure around role playing that character, right? But if we are playing one shot, you know, and I just want to do something, is it really necessary to like have all those mechanics to work against the player? I don't think so. But then again, I know so many people likes a lot of crunch and they like to have rules to be governed and to have the rules as a, you know, framework for everything that happens within the narrative. I'm more of a guy who's like, okay, you know, if you want to do it, do it. We're going to figure out somehow. And that kind of comes down to accepting that dissonance, that it might happen, it will happen, is okay if it happens. It really depends on the things you've all said before, communication, right? If we no matter if it's a one shot or campaign, if we just sit down and talk about our expectations and how we want to proceed with things like that, if they happen, then it's okay, right? So it's less, you know, I think it's always kind of players first, and characters maybe second, right? It's at least for me, but then again, it wouldn't work for everyone. So if someone wants to go character first, then by all means enforce those mechanics to keep the immersion or keep whatever you want to keep, I guess.
Yeah, and that's actually key. I mean, there are really good points there in relation to, for example, your example of the character with intelligence 5. It's almost like if it's irrelevant to the game, don't have it. As in, don't put somebody in a situation. If you're going to run a game where you want to have puzzles and you expect those puzzles to be solved by the players, almost don't give them an intelligence stat because otherwise you're creating dissonance within your own game at that point. You want a game that's about solving puzzles, but you've given them the fallback of an intelligence stat where actually a player will go, well, I'm not engaging with this part of the game because my character is stupid and therefore I can't help you. And you're kind of creating a barrier to the player by saying, yeah, their character lacks the faculty to deal with what's going on. But it's the notion of having characters presented to a player in such a way that there's nothing on the character sheet that doesn't really build on the notion of what the game's about. I'm very much now going into the harmony side of things, that, you know, if you want to run a game that embraces certain ways of playing, don't put things on the character sheet that will distract. Don't put things on the character sheet which will be a barrier. And keep things simple. I've seen, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I've seen character sheets at conventions which have 1 to 2 pages of character background. Okay, now that shows an aspiration to a deep narrative experience, but is it suitable for a 3 or 4 hour session? To expect the first, you know, expect somebody to grok their own character if they need to read through it. As somebody who has ADHD, I would need that a week or 2 in advance to actually spend the time, you know, absorbing that information. And if I sit down at a session and was presenting with a 3 or 4 page character sheet, I would actually be at a disadvantage from the get-go, because I would not be able to. There's no chance I'll ever grok that character, and my whole connection with the game will be lost as a result. In terms of utilizing mechanics to build characters, I think I feel like I'm now the person who's giving opinions about convention-based or one-shot type things. Don't use pre-gens that have just come with the game. Create pre-gens that fit the adventure. Again, this is, if you use a set of pre-gens that come with a game, maybe that pre-gen's got accountancy and there is no financial dealings in your adventure. You know, it's that notion, you know, if you have an adventure that's about going into a hospital and uncovering the horror that's in that location, maybe there's no reason to have an architect and an ex-soldier, because all their skills are about things that are going to actually create dissonance themselves by trying to use their character, or they will feel distanced from the game, and you are creating a level of disconnect by giving them things that they feel they can't generate a connection, or they're going to generate noise or whatever. You need to build an experience and look to use the game that you have in your hands to make it a whole experience. And as a result, it needs to be finessed in a certain way, so that you don't end up, if anything, creating a challenge for you and the players at the table.
I actually agree. Like when I do convention games, I usually pick characters or pre-gens that are kind of really adjusted for them, and then I also write just like half a page or something of like connections to the other players, their motivation, or like suggestions for like motivations or dark secret or trauma, anything that kind of fits to the story that players can use. They can also ignore it. I'm always saying like this is just for you to kind of immerse the character quickly and understand that these topics are kind of what would fit in the theme, in the intention of how you can play the character without kind of creating dissonance, as you said, because if you create 5 pre-gens that are all very war or combat focused, but you have a academic study scenario, that might be a bit different then in that case. I mean,
Yeah.
there are scenarios that are kind of open-ended, like where it depends on what characters you bring in, and kind of it changes the overall outcome. That is completely clear, but that needs to be then understood. I think that as a GM, you should, because you're offering a game, right? You're spending these 4-5 hours with people together, and you want to have them want to have a good time with them. So then, just be sure that you understand what game do you even want to run. Make it clear what type of game it is, and yeah.
So Ferne did a really good job with the pre-gens she wrote for No Glimmer Through the Night, in how she kind of structured them in a way that they, regardless of what combination of those pre-gens you took into the story, they would work for it. With like the skills being relevant and stuff. So that's a benefit of using pre-gens, but only when they're written for the specific story you're telling, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, is that a lot of adventures will have pre-gens, or stories or adventures will have pre-gens, and typically you should be able to rely on those ones being relevant for the adventure, but also they might not be relevant for a different story, as like referenced by Paul, but like stuff that the pre-gens in the core book of any game, probably, as Paul was saying, probably you want to be at least be wary of bringing them into adventures and stories, because they're very likely to not necessarily have the appropriate kind of setup for that story, depending on the system and things. I think something I'd also bring up, which I think is an interesting inverse of like the example of the horrible hospital thing, is that one thing you also want to be aware of is not having one character who's way more equipped to be in this session. Because like if you're running it in a hospital, you probably don't want one character who's a doctor, who's just going to be able to kind of like steamroll through all of the knowledge stuff because they know how a hospital works. That said, you might want that. You might want that as a fallback to be able to feed information in, just something to be aware of, because especially in like a con setting, you really don't want a single character basically just dominating the session just because of the skills they've ended up with. Yeah.
One thing, and admittedly, it's extra work for you if you're running a game, is if you are running a game with quite a complicated character sheet, but the actual adventure you want to run has a focus to it, make a new character sheet. If so, or maybe I know, horror, just use a Word document or something and just put down what they need to know. Yeah, often when if you go to run a game, you want to give them the whole experience, but maybe you are trying to run a game that's slightly at odds with what the system is designed for. So an example I might give actually is a situation where the company involved has taken this step. So, for example, with Chaosium and Call of Cthulhu, which has quite a complicated character sheet, Rivers of London, which also deals with horrors, has a much shortened version of that character sheet. You only have a dozen skills as compared to whatever the 40, 50 that you might get on a Call of Cthulhu character sheet, because the focus of the game is very specific. You are working for the police, or you are consultants to the police. So there are only a small number of skills that are shared. So you have generic skills like being able to find things, and you have very specific skills that relate to your special, what specialism you've got, maybe history or something. But you keep it very, very simple, very focused, so that someone can very clearly see what they are, really good at, what they are capable of doing, and so. I think it's possible to use a system that it's in reference to that Intelligence 5 earlier. Maybe just run the game with D&D, but maybe just this once you don't have an intelligence stat. I don't know, but because for this game you want the puzzles to be solved by the players, so you just remove it. Yeah, it's that. As I said, it may be a little bit works, especially if as a somebody running the games, you always want to put a really a professional character sheet in front of the players. I don't think you should worry about that. The players want to play the game, and I'm fortunate. Literally, I've got signups for an upcoming convention, which made me feel very special. Where the game only had a title, but 5 people had signed up before any more information, because they know that I will run a good game. But that doesn't mean that I could probably turn up with very simple. I actually will turn up with much simplified character sheets, because the system I want to use for that game normally has quite a complicated character, but I know what sort of game I want to run. So you just focus it down on the element that you need for that particular session.
So I'm not actually sure the camera's going to show this because it likes that, but kind of half. So for game designers specifically, a thing you can consider doing is what we did, but it just made me disappear. That's amazing. But No Glimmer Through the Night, which is a starter set we did for Locus. There's a bunch of characters, pre-gen characters, and they're all general. Kind of, they aren't like set characters. They don't have set histories. They just have like a title. So it's things like the cleric, and you have a background, but you get to kind of pick what it is. They've got 2 stats decided for them, their highest and their lowest, and then you fill in the rest. So you can kind of customize the characters. But the thing that I wanted to hone in on, based on what Paul was just saying, is as game designers, when we wrote that, because it's a pre-gen starter story for Locus, we have a set of 3 double-sided cards and 1 non-double-sided card, so 7 card sides essentially of just the core information for every character. So you've got their character sheet, which is a double-sided, but it's a card this big. You've got a card that has their goals on it as a character. So these are the things your character's looking to achieve in the session. You've got the haunts effects, so like the key sort of, you need to be aware as a player that when this happens, you need to be like this thing happens. You can gain willpower when this thing happens to your character, because there's roleplay based kind of willpower intake and outtake for characters in Locus. So we've got that on a card. We've got their items on cards, because items are on cards. And it's essentially, we've just given any GM that wants to run that session, there are printing pages for it. Basically, the core stuff you can just hand a character, and most of it is designed to be reference info as well. So it's not just, you need to read this, here, read these 7 cards. It's no. During the game, these are your quick reference, and we've already made them for the people who want to run the game. So as a game designer, this is actually a thing you can do to preempt and take that burden off the GM of having to custom down those sheets and things. Just wanted to highlight that, because it's a really good point, but also it's nice to be able to take that burden off of the people who are being awesome enough to run your game at conventions.
Mm-hmm. Paweł, any comments from you on this point?
No, again, I think I'm the last one, and I have nothing left to say about this, because it's just all been said.
Okay. I might want to kind of go back a bit more also from the advice situation. We talked a bit about this, but let's say a new group, first-time GM, or maybe even first-time players. And since we talked a bit about the dissonance aspect, some of the games obviously have this punishment mechanic of, you read a tome, but you lose sanity, or you face a monster, you get mortified. So like you try to avoid it the next time it happens in the scenario. What are some tips from your perspective when that new GMs could utilize, or players as a group should kind of remember when they realize, oh, I start to disengage because the thing kind of punishes me in a sense, or like there's not the reward that I want to, because I realize that something happens to the from the mechanic that disencourages me to do that again. I know it's obviously pretty broad, but like yeah, maybe some tips again that can also be adapted for players.
Paweł, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. And I have a strong opinion on that because just don't play the games where you have mechanics like sanity, madness, or whatever, and they're just numbers, and it doesn't do anything narratively, or it doesn't do anything in a meta play, or it doesn't really affect anything other than your next roll on a dice. Just I absolutely hate those. And I know a lot of popular systems use that kind of thing, but if that's something that you want to avoid, then just don't play those games. Many other games that kind of try to actually tie those rolls or those kind of sanity mechanics or whatever that is to make it more harmonious, as we all said before. So that's my tip. Find those games. It's not always, not everything perfect will be found in the mainstream. There's so many amazing indie games that tries to actually convey the sense of dread, of fear, of anxiety through some other means, not only a number on your character sheet. So go find those games. And that's my best bet.
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Is that it? I mean, I would say, I guess the weird thing is though, if the punishment mechanic makes you feel odd, I don't know, is it work? Maybe it's working. I can't. It occurs to me that it maybe it needs to be if there is a punishment mechanic, it needs to be well supported and explained within the system, so that the whoever's running the game doesn't use it in a way that makes the players feel totally detached, but perhaps the mechanic is there to reinforce the notion. And because what I understand what you're saying about the sanity mechanic, I think it just needs to be it needs to be treated as you say as more than a number, but in a game where it is a number, it needs to be considered and implemented in a way that makes it more than that. Because notionally, to take an example of that sort of game where you have somebody who feels on paper is very competent, the sanity number is kind of devoid, is completely separate from their competence, and that perhaps is where whoever runs the game needs to be given either have a way that they're going to approach this, or have the ideally as a game designer you need to explain how to approach that, how that value, which seems to be totally separate, and it may be mechanically you've generated it in a way that seems to be completely separate from the way everything else has been done. I'll just call it out. So, Call of Cthulhu, you are using your power stat to generate your sanity, but your power stat probably had almost nothing to do with your character's competence, which is down to their intelligence, education, strength, dexterity, etc. Their actual skills are not determined by their power. The power in the game is only related really to magic and luck, but it has nothing to do with their competence as an individual. I think I have been playing Call of Cthulhu since early 1980s, and I love the game. I think it requires a certain it does and it's in there. I think there's a lot of guidance within the game. It needs that notion that they're, the horror involved can be, needs to be considered a little bit more. It needs to be, I've already used this word this session, I'm going to mark myself off for this, finessing by the person running the game to ensure that it is both perceived as a punishment to a degree. You are delving into things which humanity were not meant to delve into. That's the whole point. That's why that sanity number is going down. But make sure that it's understood and it's not simply seen as a, in a computer, in a game, a console game, or whatever it might be. It's just if you just allow it to be a bar at the bottom of the screen that is dropping towards zero, then you're not giving it its true worth. You need, as a group, to make that a relevant. You can't just treat it as a number. It needs to be considered and used in a way that is going to support the gameplay and make it functionally feel connected and make you as a player feel rewarded rather than punished. Your sanity is dropping, okay? You are actually getting closer to understanding the truth of humanity's irrelevance in the universe. Make it, that should be something that is a reward. You are getting closer to the there's a word in my brain which isn't going to come to the apotheosis, or whatever the word I'm probably after is completely different. You are approaching the singularity of understanding that you are totally irrelevant. It is, there is a reward to it. So I guess it is ensuring that it's not just a number. It is tied to the experience, and that's we come back to the earlier notion of making sure that everyone at the table embraces what the game is about, so that something that is presented as a number is not just treated as a number. Because then you definitely get into the situation of the game where you ask somebody who's approaching a door in a spooky house what they're going to do. If they say, "Can I spot hidden?" you say, is that, that's treating the game as a game, not as a narrative experience. It's, you explain what you do. Don't tell me what your character sheet says. So in the same way, that 65% sanity should be more than just, a number on the sheet.
Yeah. But funnily enough, there's this example from video games about creating the tension by using ludonarrative dissonance. So in Batman Arkham Asylum, the first game of the trilogy, there's this scene where we kind of meet Scarecrow, and there's this moment where the game basically crashes, and it gives us a kind of a blue screen. It wasn't blue back then, but you know what I mean, like a error message on a screen, and we're like, oh, my PC crashed. What happened? And no, it's just within the game. It's just just to kind of create that sense of fear that, oh no, my game just crashed. And I feel like it probably a bit difficult to translate into tabletop RPGs, but I can imagine that, if you fail, like if you have like zero sanity, the GM will tear your character sheet apart and like, oh, now go, right? So there are things to kind of break that, like by breaking immersion, by maybe creating that ludonarrative dissonance is also a way to actually create a kind of sense of fear, etc. So like, yeah, it's fine that we kind of came the whole circle and kind of came back to the roots of actually using dissonance to do something. But yeah, but I do agree with you, Paul, in terms of the other stuff that you said. So yeah.
And I'm using that. I'm totally using that. I think that's a thing. That's definitely a thing. You take the character sheet away, you tear it into 4 pieces. Maybe you even sellotape it back wrong, and then hand it back to them so that for the rest of the game, that Or you take some of their dice away. I mean, don't physically touch them. Just tell them to put some of those dice away so they can't use them for the rest of the game. Putting them in this. Yeah.
You
So,
should try playing Locus, because one of the reasons that we've got items on cards is because they degrade and break, so that you as the GM can then take the card and tear it in half when their item breaks because they used it too much. Just as it's funny to hear those suggestions talked about. It's like, oh, there's an element of that in the thing we did. That's fun. Yeah,
going
sorry,
back
Steph.
to no, that's fine. Going back to the question of, punishments for the player and what do you do when the mechanics might seem like that. And I think that I have a couple of thoughts on this. So the first one is that mechanics should be harmonious with other mechanics. There shouldn't be a standalone number somewhere that represents something amorphous and doesn't interact with anything else that's going on mechanically. So as an example, we don't have a sanity mechanic. We have your character can get stressed out, and that interacts with the willpower mechanic. It gets harder to use willpower when you're stressed out. And with that, there's very much a degree of there are things you can do that will stress you out. There are things you can do that will chill you out. And it comes down to player choice. So there's a lot of aspects of carrot and stick. So do you accept the carrot and also accept the stick? So you almost want the carrot to be for the player and the stick to be for the other way around. The carrot to be for the player and the stick to be for the character. So the character might feel like is getting punished, but the player doesn't. And I think that there's a distinction there we can make of, does this feel like a punishment for the player interacting with the game, or is this a natural consequence of something a character has done and a choice that they have made? Yeah. That was a distinction I kind of wanted to make, is that there's there was a bit of a conflation with character and player being punished simultaneously, but actually if the mechanic has a consequence or a feedback element that negatively impacts the player experience, that's different to the character having a bad time because they've done a bad thing. And that actually characters having a bad time because they've done a bad thing, that can be quite harmonious with the genre of horror, that whole get your comeuppance kind of thing, at least with the type of horror that Ferne and I have made, where we're dealing with guilt and regret quite a lot.
Yeah, so just to return to not to return to the original question, because Steph was just confronting it as well, but to give my thoughts on the question of sort of if players are running or butting up against punishments and it's stopping them from engaging with the game, whereby they're doing things, but it gets to a point where the game is throwing so much at them for doing things that they kind of check out. My very flippant answer is find a different game, because that one's not working for you. But I also appreciate that that's not really useful advice if you're in the middle of a session or a campaign, or if you're running one at a convention where you don't have the chance to play it, to pick a different game. But I would encourage people to consider the idea, just generally, that if stuff isn't working for you, someone's probably made a game that will. There's so many out there, and there's so many awesome, incredible creators out there who are making so many interesting, different, very specific things. I'm certain that there's something out there that will work for you, and there's a lot of creators that have done a lot of work. I would say that me and Steph are probably one of them, but I also don't think that whether we've succeeded or not is not for us to say. But there are creators out there who've done a lot of work to try and avoid having that specific problem come up in their game at all, where there are systems baked into the game where there are incentives to keep going, both in character and as a player, rather than it just kind of being you're keeping going because that's what you're supposed to do, you're playing a game. Like you're playing the game and you're at the session, so of course your character's going to keep doing these things, even though it feels like they shouldn't. I I think that people playing TTRPGs should definitely have that in the back of their head. Like engage with the game you're playing. You're there for a reason to play it, but also an effectively done story, game, whatever, is going to have reasons, is going to bake in reasons why that doesn't like create a dissonance for you. And some of those might be personal. So it might be that the game isn't working for you. Some of them might be general. It might be it's not a good game. That is a thing that exists. I can't, I'm not going to give you any examples because again, it's an opinion thing. But yeah, there are games that are poorly designed. They exist out there. And then there are games that are very well designed, but that might not work for you. Yeah, consider trying other stuff. It's a good attitude to have, in my opinion.
Great.
Oh, the cat's gone. Good.
I maybe want to add as a kind of summary, because I think that's a great kind of wrap for this, and looking at the time kind of coming towards an end here. When running convention games, you have the opportunity that you probably signed up for the convention. You know when it is, and you have the time to playtest your game before the convention, somewhere with friends and so forth, and see if the scenario with the pre-gen characters that you might make for the convention are working, or if they're not working, if you run into something, right? I would recommend, especially for new people who come to conventions, playtest at least a game. I mean, nowadays we have online resources, we have these wonderful communities all over the place, where you can test different systems, where you can play online with people that introduce new systems, and just get a feeling to kind of understand, do you like the game, or is that maybe not for you, as Ferne, you said, and the others. And then, yeah, from a GM perspective, run your game before a convention, see how it runs, how it feels, and if it really kind of comes to the level of emotions and kind of themes that you want to convey with that game. And if it doesn't, then yeah, think about maybe there are other things out there. Which kind of brings me to a question that was also asked in the audience, since we have so many great indie creators here on board. And we named a few others, like 10 Candles, Alice is Missing, Dread, and others that were mentioned in various other panels. You yourself have created other systems. Can you name a few as well that you like, and maybe why it's so specific for something? Because what we also heard is like, find a specific game for the idea that you want to, or the game that you want to play, right? Let's start maybe with Paweł.
Oh gosh. No, it doesn't really save me that I'm first now. Maybe it's even worse. Because I'm just oh, it's all blank because like you've already mentioned, I wanted to mention 10 Candles and Alice is Missing actually, but now yeah, I'm just out. Because that's my problem. I don't play at all. I GM a little bit, but not too much. So I'm just so limited. I don't know. I don't know. I've heard Locust is really good. So check that one out. But I think yeah, I've already mentioned Dread, which is like one probably top three of my like all time, because it is so simple in what it's doing and how it's doing it. But yeah, no, I don't really
Can you
have anything
maybe
that
just
would that would
explain why Dread, or for what situation Dread would be great to play?
I think for many, I think, for every genre of horror, I think it does work, but it works perfectly well for things like slashers. I was like one of those very rare moments of my life when I was a player. I was invited for this actual play, and we've played Dread, and it was a kind of a slasher setting. So it made a lot of sense to actually run it through Dread because Then again, each character after each tower collapses dies horrifically, and that was a lot of fun. And it kind of supported the basic narrative around the kind of the final girl situation, and everyone dying. So it was fun, but also it created so much tension. Like there was nothing like, if you are playing a game and you have a serial killer just chasing you, you're like, you all the tension, there is a tension that comes from the narrative itself. You have descriptions of how creepy it is, and kind of that builds some of the tension. But then you just, pull up a machete and roll d20. Oh, it's a critical success. Hooray, perfect, right? But here, like, you know that you're going to succeed step by step, but it's going to be increasingly more difficult to a point in which you just, like, you're physically shaking trying to pull that block out of the Jenga tower, and kind of you feel like your character's fate is literally in your hands. And there are nothing, like, you cannot escape in any other way. Like, you have to pull the Jenga block, and it kind of that moment creates all the tension for you and for your character. So it just perfectly works for that specific purpose. So by all means, it's not a game to run everything, but it's a great game to do this one particular thing so darn good.
Great, thank you.
So I've got a few. So first, the D-Sanction's really good. I do own it. It's somewhere. I was gonna have it so that I could show it, but it's somewhere in this mess that is my existence. Um, but that's good. Check that out. I'll let Paul do a proper plug for it in a bit, though. Um, Wretched and Alone is a solo game, but it's built on the Wretched framework, which is a card drawing framework for solo games. There's a lot of different ones. Wretched and Alone is just the one that I first kind of encountered, and is made by a very talented writer, Chris Bissett, who's made a load of stuff. He's worth checking out, absolutely. And it's just very effective in the way that, because of the weighting of the game, is that it's incredibly unlikely that you'll succeed and your character will escape. So, but there is a potential. So you're journaling a character who has this glimmer of hope, but you also know that it's really unlikely. And the cards really build that, and the way that everything's weighted in that game really builds that to help you be in that mindset while you're doing the journaling. It's a really effective system. I can't give specific recommendations, but you should absolutely be checking out Ecstasis Games. They have made a number of small, in particular, zine games that are horror, like single session horrors that are just, they've got bunches of them. They're very prolific and they're amazing. They're definitely worth checking out. And also a slightly off the wall one, I would say, for something that's kind of horror, more horror flavored than actual horror, maybe check out Through the Breach, which is it's a TTRPG spin-off of a skirmish game called Malifaux. If you like skirmish games, play Malifaux. It's excellent, or at least the third edition was. I haven't read the fourth edition rules yet because I've been busy. But the third edition was fantastic, so I expect the fourth edition is also fantastic. Great game, worth a look. But the tabletop RPG has a lot of these kind of existential horror things. There's a lot of horror flavor in the kind of the world anyway, but you've also got this, you are fated in certain dire ways, and your character has that drawn, and it affects how your character gets built. And that kind of is kind of a shadow overcasting your character at all times, which is a really interesting way to kind of play it. It also uses a deck of cards, so if you're interested in kind of alternate ways to do conflict resolution, it's a really interesting one because it uses a deck of cards and you have a hand of cards rather than, and that doesn't use dice at all. So those are my quick horror sort of recommendations, I think.
Great, thank you. Steph, Paul?
So yeah, I mean, Fern said a lot of stuff that I was going to echo because we play a lot of the same games, surprisingly. A couple of, again, kind of horror flavored things that aren't necessarily horror themselves, but can lend themselves well to it. I want to shout out Dead Letter Society by Rory Montford. A really interesting two-person journaling game where you write each other letters as vampires. And it's kind of done through the story is told by what you tell each other in these letters. And, you know, the themes are based on card draws. Got example somewhere. So like 10 of Wands might be overwhelm. But yeah, it's a really interesting story. You can get a really nice vibe, and the action of doing it through letter writing is itself a really interesting way to explore that role-playing vibe that I find really interesting. And you know, having to describe horrific events in a letter to someone is a very interesting way of viewing, like a very interesting lens to tackle it through. If you choose to take the game that way, you could also do it more lighthearted. Again, another kind of thing, you could have horror elements in it. I actually still really like Paranoia as a game that I'd recommend checking out if you're looking for that kind of potentially silly but also quite disturbing if you think too hard about it scenario where you play troubleshooters who are very replaceable. And that's all I'll say for now on that, because Paranoia is one of those games you don't want to say too much about it. Yeah, those are my two kind of main additions, I think, to what Fern said.
I would add that Paranoia is excellent, especially during the period when I wrote for it. And there's some great, if you can find a copy of Weapons of Mass Destruction, WMD, it has some of the finest horror tinged missions that have ever been written for Paranoia. I won't mention Desanction, actually, but I'll just waft it anyway, just as it's got a mention. This is going to cross over with something you were saying beforehand, David, in the connection here. My thinking was around the notion of flashlight horror, the games, console type games where you have a limited light source, limited capacity. I can't remember for the life of me. There's a game where you have a flashlight and you're wandering around in fields and there's been an alien invasion or something, and you can constantly hear things in the distance. And the name of the game didn't come back to me during this, but anyway, it's that notion of putting effectively a timer in front of the player. Now, to a degree, something like Shadow Dark has done that with torches, where you have an actual time frame. So the horror there is knowing that the darkness is literally connected with the game time, the time that you are playing the game rather than the time in the game. You have an hour to find more torches, or maybe knowing that the limited inventory that you have available to you means that you can only carry so many torches when really you want to carry other things that might save your life. I found that how this connects with you before in terms of your preparation for a convention or a one shot. Know how long the game is going to last. That's why you play test it with groups beforehand. If you play test it and find that the game only achieves its horror peak after 4 hours, you don't run it a con, because you won't achieve the peak. So actually timing is really important. And so I have used, in games like Shadow Dark where it's built in, timing is really great even if it's not built in. I have run games of Free League's Alien, for example. The Chariot of the Gods, I think, is one of the adventures that came out with the first edition. Just putting a kitchen timer on the table with an hour or 3 hours or 2 hours or something set on it, and not telling them why it's set, is a fantastic way of instilling sort of the sense of tension. And bizarrely enough, I ran a fighting fantasy adventure, which is definitely nothing to do with horror, where there was an actual candle on the table, which would run for an hour. That was how long they had to solve the situation. So there are games which have that supply notion to it. And actually Black Hack, as well, had that notion of supplies, which, while not a horror game, it was the inspiration for Cthulhu Hack, in using a supply die, something that when you, as you are using something, you roll a die, and if you roll a 1 or 2, it gets smaller, and that die gets smaller and smaller and smaller until finally it runs out. And having those games that key in, I think actually maybe Paweł mentioned it earlier, having something visceral, something you can touch, like Dread, which is where something that connects with the player but also impacts on the character, can be a really good way of bringing the horror closer, and making somebody feel the sort of tension build in their body, knowing that every time they roll that die, is it going to drag them closer to their doom?
Great. Looking at the time, I think we're to an end, but I do want to mention also a few recommendations. For one is, which was also mentioned in a chat, Trophy Dark, as well as Brindlewood Bay by Jason Cordova. Also, it's adaptation by Sue Savage to Matrons of Mystery, where you play old cozy ladies having a tea party and then solving mysteries, which is fantastic cozy murder if you go to. Actually also one of probably the most difficult game for me to find players for, but at the same time it's the most horrific ones to play with some, is Corpork, as it's beautifully, nobody wants to play their real life self in a corporation again, so like finding players for it and then playing the real life horror of like, oh yeah, you can't get a stapler. The stapler will you will need to send in a service request. You need to do this. And like getting the players the horror of real life incorporated is so fun, but it's very hard to get players for, unfortunately. And yeah, I think there's so many indie games, and we are going to compile a list of all of these and put them here in the thread, or in the video. I would say thank you very much for attending the panel. If there are any last words and of wisdom and where people can find you, let's go around the table once more. Let's start this time with Steph.
You kept freezing there, David. That's why we're probably looking slightly bemused as to what's happening next.
Oh dear.
You've gone all this time without freezing.
Of course, like at the end. Yes, I was just going to say thank you very much for attending. It was a pleasure to have you all on the panels, for all your great input and recommendations. We'll compile the list of all the games and recommendations that you've mentioned. Yeah, given the time, I would ask you to give a brief idea of where people can find you again, maybe some words of wisdom or something that you want to give along. And yeah, let's start with Steph this time.
Okay. So yeah, you can find Cobblepath Games on our website, cobblepathgames.co.uk, or check out our itch store, cobblepathgames.io. This is me failing to remember the things. Ferne will correct me.
Type Cobblepath Games into itch, you'll find it.
Yeah, you'll find us. You can get our stuff on there. In terms of more social media stuff, Ferne kind of handles our Blue Sky. And yeah, I may swing by to run some more games in the future, with the Illusion HorrorCon.
Great, thank you. Paweł.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you, dear panelists, for being here with me. It was a pleasure. So you can find me by just Googling my name, or just by Googling Haltung Storytelling, or just by looking for my games directly, like Korpoborg or Whispers of the Woods, and you'll find me.
Fantastic. Ferne?
Yes. So as Steph said, you can find Cobblepath stuff there. I'm on Blue Sky under Cobblesprite, or Fern Milton. You can probably find me on Blue Sky through that. I'm relatively active on there, like talking about TTRPG stuff. Also, The only other thing, obviously, we wrote Locus. Go check Locus out. It's a horror game if you like horror, which you presumably do if you're here. Thank you, everyone. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've had a really good time. And also, if you're in the UK and you fancy trying out LARP, our LARP Dreamlands is on its second year this year, and we are open for more players. Hooray!
Fantastic. Paul.
So I had to write this down while everyone was talking, or else I would have a Steph situation of hey. Where can you find me? So justcrunch.com is kind of a hub, but I have this habit of creating domains for my games. So cthulhuhack.com, the dsanction.com, sanctionrpg.com, I think, are all basically the sort of heart for sort of specific game needs. All Rolled Up is run by my wife, but I have a strong connection to that in that my independent stuff is produced through All Rolled Up, so allrolledup.co.uk. I can be found on Blue Sky as Paul Baldowski or as Just Crunch, and also a bit on Instagram, both for Paul Baldowski and Just Crunch as well. Alongside all those various games, I have late pledging going on for both the Desanction Monad Edition and Kirk Bird, which are both late pledging on Kickstarter. So if you want to support independent publishing, please do go to any of these places and do that. That would be brilliant.
Thank you. Well, with that, I want to say thank you once more. Thank you, audience. And yeah, it was a fantastic panel on Ludonarrative Dissonance, or Ludo Roleplay Dissonance, or Harmony. Thank you again all for being here. And we wish you a wonderful rest of the con and a wonderful Sunday.